Good evening, everybody. Welcome tonight to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thanks for braving the snow. I see a lot of boots like mine. We're really glad to have all of you here. As you all know, today actually, the kind of preliminary rounds and some of the Olympic events started, and tomorrow is the opening ceremonies. And so we thought it'd be appropriate to have a conversation about Russia, about the Olympics, about Snowden, and a whole lot of topics that have been in the news over the last couple of months. We've got an expert panel of folks here at Harvard to talk about these issues. I'm most excited to introduce for the first time on our forum stage, Jill Dougherty, who is a Shorenstein Fellow at the Shorenstein Center for the Media, Politics, Press. I got the new title, Shorenstein Center on the Media, Politics, and Policy.
All right, no longer pressing.
Yeah, I can't do it as well. But Jill's a fellow here for the semester, and we're really glad to have her, and she's going to be tonight's moderator. She, for many years, covered foreign affairs for CNN and was based in Moscow for 9 years. So she's an expert herself, and I'm sure will contribute to the conversation. So please join me in welcoming Jill.
Trey. Let's see, everybody can hear. I hear a little bounce of the sound, but I think we're okay. I am very excited to be doing this because I think the timing couldn't be better. As Trey mentioned, the Olympics in Sochi they're beginning right now, but the opening ceremony will be tomorrow, Friday night, broadcast. Obviously it'll be streamed, you can see it live. Billions of people around the world are going to watch that, and I think that it's going to be a very important moment because there will be a lot of messaging coming out from that opening ceremony. And what better than three true experts on Russia, and I'm really dying to hear what you're going to say about all of this. We're going to try to get into a lot of different parts, different aspects of Sochi and the situation in Russia right now. Essentially, we're going to have a conversation here among us for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions. So I'm sure you're going to have a lot of good questions. You have, I believe, some bios of the participants, but just very briefly, from the end, Simon Saradzhyan, he's a fellow assistant director on the Initiative to Prevent Nuclear Terrorism at the Belfer Center right here at Harvard. He's an expert in arms control, security, and many other things. Interestingly, he worked as deputy editor of the Moscow Times and Moscow Correspondent for Defense News, so also a journalist. And he was in charge of the coverage, actually, two major terrorism incidents in Russia, Beslan and the Dubrovka theater hostage crisis in 2002. Then in the middle, we have Dr. Alexandra Vacroux. She is the executive director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies here at Harvard. And she's also with the working group on the future of U.S. Russian relations, which is you might want to Google it, check it out, very high level means of discussing leading Americans and Russians, discussing the thorniest issues in the relationship between the two countries. And then finally, last but not least, we have Brigadier General Kevin Ryan. And he is retired from the Army. He is Director, Defense and Intelligence Projects, also at the Belfer Center. We met in Moscow when he was at the embassy as a defense attaché. He is truly an expert in missile defense and defense issues in general. So without going too far into this, I want to jump right in with security. That is, of course, as we're looking at Sochi, there has been a lot written about it, a lot out there in the blogosphere about whether these games will be safe. And Simon, I'd like to start with you. Can Vladimir Putin guarantee that these games will be as safe as games generally have been in other countries?
Well, I'd like to quote former US presidential candidate Mitt Romney, who, commenting on the security in Sochi, said there's no such thing as 100% security. And I'd say he's right. Nobody can guarantee there will be no terrorist attacks in the greater Sochi area. But I'd say Russia has made a tremendous effort to make sure that doesn't happen. And I'm not talking only about the so-called ring of security or steel ring in the area, which is about 60 miles long, 35 miles wide, where participants and visitors reside. I'm talking about the general effort, which includes intensification of effort to keep the insurgents on the run in the North Caucasus, multi-agency response, which includes the Ministry of Defense, the Federal Security Service, the Interior Ministry, the Ministry for Emergency Situations. There's a 70,000 strong grouping.
70,000
forces,
security
combined
personnel?
forces in the area. That's 7 times more than in Vancouver. It's also 3 times less than in Beijing. But it's 3 times less than during the Beijing Olympic Games. There were about 100,000 police officers and about 110,000 soldiers deployed for the games in Beijing, as far as I know from open sources. So I'd say this, and given all the hardware in the area, air defense systems, anti-sabotage boats, even Moskva missile cruise carrier is the cruiser, excuse me. I'd say it's a pretty good effort to prevent, but again, nobody has a crystal ball and nobody can give you 100% guarantee.
Kevin, should we
Sure,
first names?
absolutely.
Kevin, tell us about the United States, the Pentagon, the State Department, as they look, and the White House, as they look at this right now. Obviously, some Americans have said they are not going because their security is paramount. They are nervous about that. I was looking at some, the Pew Research Center said that 44% of the people that they questioned in the United States think it's a bad decision to hold the games in Russia, 44%. 32% thought it was good. And of the people who think it's bad, 62% cite security. And I think significantly, only 4% cited LGBT issues, which have been talked about a lot, 4%. So overwhelmingly, people are worried about security. As the US government looks at this, how worried are they?
So I think there is a concern in the US government, and I think part of the perception that's prevalent in our country about the security issue is a result of the fact that parts of the government that are normally invited in by foreign countries to help with security, help planning, this would be the FBI, it would be the CIA, it would be even the military itself. They have not had that kind of a cooperative relationship that they had with other countries. For example, China, which is a country that most of us consider to be an adversary in many ways, was very cooperative on the Olympics and allowed us to set up command centers and to bring in the things that we could add to their security. And they leveraged us and they used our help. And that, I think, generated a positive kind of attitude, at least in the government, which may be permeated out from there into the press and to the people that came. But that has been, that's not been there for these Olympics. And that I get from my colleagues back in the Defense Department, from contacts in the State Department and within the intelligence community. You know, it's not a comment that the Russians can't take care of their own security. That's not the point. But everybody can use help. And in this case, they have been largely shut out. So I think that...
Why?
My guess is that it's a combination of both pride on the part of Russian leadership and a little bit of paranoia on the part of the Russian leadership, which are not things that are foreign to American leaders either. So I don't mean to say that they are more prideful and more paranoia than we are, or paranoid than we are, but But I think if I had to pick two things, they would be very human factors. You know.
Alexandra, why Sochi? What is Putin trying to do with these Olympics? Is it a domestic, obviously it's international, but what's going on internally in Russia that would make these games extremely important for him?
Well, I think they're very important for him in terms of keeping up this image of being extremely powerful, of being a good manager, of being able to host magnificent Olympics, not just Olympics, but Winter Olympics in a subtropical climate, and making it kind of the biggest, best Olympics ever. And this shows to the international audience that Russia remains a great power, capable of great feats of both imagination and implementation. But also for the domestic audience, it has required a huge mobilization of financial resources, of the political elite, of the economic elite, or so-called oligarchs. All of these people had to be mobilized to help him implement this vision. And it demonstrates to those elites that he is very much in charge, that he can make big things happen, even in a country that may have had a reputation for complexity or problems in implementation. So it does a lot to really boost his image both at home and abroad.
You know, there's a lot of negative, obviously, just go onto the web, a lot of negative commentary, and in fact, there's a lot of mockery, really, of bathrooms, et cetera. But within Russia, do we have an idea of how Russians look at the games?
I think for the most part, they're quite proud of what's happening. There's a history of being extremely supportive of athletic prowess and achievements. I think they expect that they're going to do very well at these games, perhaps better than they have at the other Olympics, and that will be very important for them. And I think that there's also some resentment over the fact that there is this kind of mockery going on, this hashtag Sochi problems and things like that, and that it's really seen as a bit unfair to be casting this negative light over Olympics that haven't even started. So to some extent, there is a little bit of negative coverage within the Russian press, but for the most part, I think the attitude is, just you wait until we have this opening ceremony, like nothing you've seen before, and wait until you see we win the medals, and then we'll see kind of who's the best.
Simone, let me ask you something about the threat, where the threat is coming from, because there have been reports about the terrorist leader Doku Umarov, who used to be, I guess you'd call him separatist, / terrorist, and now he says he's kind of part of Al-Qaeda to a certain extent. Where is this threat coming from? Is it a homegrown threat? Is it Al-Qaeda? Is it international terrorism? Combination of both? What?
First of all, I'd like to point out that Russia is not really hoping to win the Olympics. It is hoping to be 4th or 5th with about 9 gold medals, which is 3 times more than during Vancouver, but it's aiming low. In terms of the threat is homegrown primarily. In the 90s, you could talk about a significant component of foreign jihadists in the North Caucasus. Since then, they've moved on to, so to say, greener pastures. One is Syria, for example. I won't associate Doku Umarov with Al-Qaeda. He has proclaimed his goal to be establishment of a caliphate in the North Caucasus and in the Muslim regions of Russia. But he has never said, I'm a member of Al-Qaeda, although he has welcomed lieutenants and emissaries from this organization. But the problem is that he's not the only threat. By the way, we don't even know whether he's alive. There's a very motley, so to say, assortment of people who practice political violence in Russia. It goes from Russian ultranationalists, which constitute a very minor part of the problem, to insurgents in the North Caucasus, who are lone wolves avenging abuses by authorities, Islamists who might or might not be part of Umarov's Caucasus Emirate, militias that report to clan leaders and do this for money or power. You could go on. The list could be very long. So this poses the problem. You don't know what the threat is because it's represented by so many different actors. And therefore, you cannot influence their motivation. All you could do is try to find them and neutralize them. And it's difficult, especially given the proximity of Sochi. Sochi is only 300 miles away from Chechnya, Kabardino-Balkaria and Chechnya, and about 360 miles away from Dagestan, which is now the hotbed. It's not Chechnya any longer. It's Dagestan and Ingushetia where you see most political violence. My calculations show Dagestan accounts for 1/4 of all political violence in Russia in the past 10 years.
And Dagestan, of course, we have to jump in because we're in Boston, and that is where the terrorists who carried out the attack on the marathon came from. Essentially, their families came from Dagestan, correct?
Well, you could say they've come from Kyrgyzstan because they live from Kyrgyzstan.
True, but
Their father is Chechen, so
they lived, I think, for a
it
while
poses a problem. But I agree that Dagestan is a big part of the problem. And there haven't been a single suicide bomber from Chechnya for years, whereas half of them, so-called black widows, as they call them, although not all of them are widows, are from Dagestan. To stop someone who is bent on killing himself or herself in the act of political violence, it's very hard. So, security perimeter in Sochi can hold, but what about places in the greater Sochi, which is the second longest city in Europe? It stretches along the coastline. What about areas outside that? Would people not panic if someone, God forbid, attacks somewhere outside the security perimeter? They would panic.
In fact, if there were an attack, let's say in Moscow, St. Petersburg, some of the bigger cities, Alexander, what if that happened, and of course we hope that it won't, what would that do to the image of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think to some extent it would be seen as something that could happen, unfortunately, to almost any leader at the same time as the Olympics. I think, however, given how much emphasis Putin has made to say that these Olympics are safe, that Russia has the security problem under control, it would be quite devastating, if only because it would also distract attention from the Olympics, which are really meant to be a jewel in the crown for him and for what he's accomplished. So I think it would be very difficult. They would try and shift attention back onto the Olympics, but it would create quite a panic, I think, within the Olympic community and the people trying to control what's happening there.
I'm interested in the messaging. That's one of the things that I'm looking at in my work here, the Russian media, et cetera, and the idea that Vladimir Putin is trying to get across about his country, which is, yes, we may have been on our heels after the end of the Soviet Union, but we're back. We're in the game. We can do things in Syria. We can solve problems in Iran. We are a force to be reckoned with. And again, this opening ceremony, I think, is going to be really significant in that. Kevin, what do you make of that? I mean, let's say where Vladimir Putin, how Vladimir Putin wants to present Russia and how the United States looks at that. I'll just one footnote on that. I was reading a quote by Vladimir Putin, the essence of which was that the West essentially really wants Russia on its knees. That's the ultimate aim of all Western policy, and wants it to give up its resources and its influence around the world. In other words, a zero-sum game. How does the White House look at this constant reference to the zero sum, and you're trying to subdue us again?
I think it's interesting, isn't it, that in a place like the Kennedy School, where we're supposed to study all these objective and large strategic reasons and issues that are supposed to be motivating countries to do this or that, and in the end, sometimes we're confronted with the fact that these are just people interacting with people, and it can get very personal. And especially if you have a country that's as highly as centralized in both its history, but in its current state as Russia. I'll give you one example, and this is a rumor, but my contacts in the U.S. government say that their counterparts in the Russian government have basically been told that Putin has told his cabinet members that until he gets his one-on-one meeting with Obama, not just these pull-asides at the G8 and so on, but until he gets his summit with Obama, no other cabinet members or agencies are supposed to get out in front of him. So if that rumor is true, then what you have is an entire apparatus that is actively working to either keep the status quo or roll back, based on the guidance of the senior leader. This might be something that you would say would only be in a Hollywood movie, but I actually believe it. I think it's emblematic of his style. It's emblematic of the structure that they have set up for leadership in Russia. And so if they're playing a very personalized game of a relationship, it's hard not to take it that way here too. I think Americans and the leadership, I think they devolve to the same kind of attitude. They take it personal.
Alexandra, what do you think about that? I mean, does that jibe with your understanding of who Vladimir Putin is, how he acts, how he leads?
Well, looking in terms of the things that have happened in U.S.-Russia relations over the past 6 or 7 years, certainly, what you see is a pattern of the Russians sort of aggrieved that they're not being taken as America's equal partner. And I think it's fair to say that they don't see themselves as being kind of in the category of smaller countries. So you have the US, you have the China, and then you have important European countries and Russia. And the Russians have told me in some of these working group meetings that, Germany, France, like these are not on the same level as Russia. Right? They really see themselves as being one of the top 2 or 3 countries. And because the United States isn't going to recognize that for strategic and kind of obvious geopolitical reasons, there's this constant sense of being aggrieved that we are not recognizing them for who they are, and therefore they are not going to step forward in order to reach common policy that's even in their own common interest in some cases. They just don't want to cooperate if they're treated as a junior partner.
Simone, put on your journalist cap, if you would. If you were covering the Sochi Olympics as a journalist back in Moscow, and you wanted to evaluate how successful they will be in achieving the goals that Vladimir Putin has, what would you be looking for? What are the signposts for success of the Games? And I don't mean just winning gold medals.
Well, immediately you could see where this Olympics is different from the predecessors. If I were an editor, I'd say, look at what the government is pointing out, look what the critics are pointing out, and look what you see yourself. The government is pointing out that a record number of heads of states are coming, 60 heads of states, including 44 will be attending the ceremony. The government is pointing out that they've added several more sports events, that they've added 12 countries are going to, for the first time ever, send their athletes. So there are many number ones they can list. The critics, of course, point out that this is the most expensive Olympics ever, and that a significant part must have been stolen. Otherwise, it won't cost $8 billion to build a road that could be otherwise covered with mink furs, as a Russian journalist calculated. And then the reality on the ground. But I would also urge them to look beyond the Olympics and see what kind of legacy. And legacy could be very positive. I mean, treat it as sunken costs. That money has already been spent. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't sue the government and say, return this money back to your budget. There's an excellent array of sports facilities, affordable accommodation, which Russia lacks. It has always lacked 3-star hotels. And there's a hope that this will be part of the whole North Caucasian tourist cluster that is supposed to generate 160,000 jobs and attract almost 4 million tourists annually. Is that a positive in the scorecard? I'd say yes. So I'd urge everyone to take a longer-term view beyond the obvious and serious problems.
Kevin, and maybe this is a good question for everybody, but why Sochi? It is closer to Tehran, I believe, Simone, correct me if I'm wrong, closer to Tehran than it is to Moscow. It's down, it has palm trees, who would know? It's not Siberia. Why Sochi? What
It
is
has a unique ecosystem. So it does have the snow. It's kind of like if you were in California or Oregon and you said, you can go from the coast up to ski in the mountains. You can do that. If the weather's cooperating and everything's wonderful, it will be a real treat to see the differences between along the water and up in the mountains. So in that regard, it's not a bad choice. In another instance, Sochi is a famous, for Russia, it is a famous place for the rich and famous to be. And I think Putin, my understanding is Putin kind of considers it his town, his pet project, and creating, highlighting Sochi and adding to its luster is in keeping with maybe with Putin's long-term plan. So. Yeah, it's not a bad choice. It could be horrible if the weather doesn't cooperate, but I think it's going to turn out to be not a bad choice.
Is there more to it, Alexandra?
Well, I've heard that a lot of it has to do with the fact that he really fell in love with the place. Kind of in the early years of his presidency, he would go there to relax, and a lot of people kind of looked out on the mountains and said, boy, it'd be great to have a ski resort right here. And things kind of developed from there. It became something that seemed like a great idea. You do have the mountains, and the mountains are pretty high compared to a lot of other parts of Russia. So it's hard to imagine a better place in Russia for these Olympics. Although there are perhaps mitigating geographical factors, I don't think that really was ever a serious consideration.
Simone, I think there's also regional development, I guess you could say, an area that except for Sochi, really doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, has been kind of left behind. What else would you say? Why not go to Siberia?
Well, I would just read what President Putin has said. And he essentially said that with these games, we will prove that North Caucasus is an attractive area for tourism, that the insurgency is diminishing in the North Caucasus, and therefore, this is my choice. So to show the whole world that he has North Caucasus firmly under control, insurgents on the run, and to also attract tourists, because let's face it, Sochi is a subtropical city, and I'd say it's a very courageous decision to hold the Olympics there. But if you were to develop a tourist cluster in Krasnoyarsk, where the slopes are very good and there's plenty of snow all the time, whereas it was raining this day in Sochi in last year. But who is going to travel to Krasnoyarsk? I mean, Krasnoyarsk is, I think, 2,000 miles away from Moscow. So it'll take any European with money probably, I don't know, 6 hours to fly there. Sochi is only 1,000 miles away from Moscow and within reach of most middle-class tourists from Europe. So these three factors matter. The need to show that Russia is capable of pulling off events like this in an area which has been branded as, insurgency infested, that terrorism is diminishing and the North Caucasus is under control, but also to attract tourists and to turn Sochi into a whole year resort, not just summer, but winter.
We're going to have some questions. I really do want to get to those, but I have one last question, maybe Alexandra, with your breadth of looking at all of this. There's kind of a counter narrative that's coming out, which is, can Russia get a fair shake? There's been so much criticism, so much mockery, so much negativity. Can they really get a fair shake in the media? Or, of course, Twitter land is not controllable. You can't just tell it what to do. But truly, is Russia getting a fair shake in terms of the coverage and the way this is being depicted?
Well, I think we need to give it a couple days to know how the coverage is really going to turn, and I suspect that most people are going to be counting on the opening ceremony and how smoothly the first couple days go off to really make a judgment. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a great deal of frustration right now on the Russian side at how the message has kind of escaped them, how they've had so much experience in keeping the domestic media, at least the television media, kind of under wraps, and having more or less compliant journalism in all of the places that are broadcast to most of the population. And here there's a situation where they really cannot control what's going out in the media. And I suspect that that would be a great source of frustration, although as Simeon pointed out before we started, there is a lot on the Russian internet about the corruption stories, the dog stories. All of these things do exist for people who want to look for them in Russia. So I think we have to wait and see, but I think it must be very irritating.
Well, are we ready to get some questions, Carrie? The microphones are working and questions are all set. I'll just give our usual warning here, Q&A guidelines. Please identify yourself, your affiliation. One brief question, which should end in a question mark. No speeches, lobbying, pontificating. Get some good questions, and again, a question mark at the end of it. Thank you. Let's begin.
All right, hi there. My name is Sitza Gofard. I'm a junior at the college, and thank you all so much for sharing your insights into what will be a really fascinating couple of weeks ahead, I guess. I wanted to ask you about the effect that, I guess, the title of this forum, From Snowden to Sochi, what effect that you think the whole, the scandal, the media issue that Edward Snowden, being essentially I guess a fugitive in Russia, an asylum seeker in Russia, will have, during this Olympic phase and in its overall relationship with the U.S. If you could comment on what your thoughts are about that.
Do you have one person that you would like to answer?
Or anyone who feels best suited to answer that question, I guess.
Kevin, do you want to start?
Sure. So Snowden is more of a symptom than a cause in my mind. He's not the reason that Obama and Putin have such a frosty relationship, but he's just another example of how their frosty relationship plays out on the stage. Certainly he doesn't help at this point in terms of resolving that relationship. Just since we brought up Snowden, I don't think that he is giving Russia secrets. I think he gave all his secrets to journalists, maybe present company accepted.
Which you're not sharing.
And so I think the Russians are learning about these revelations the same day we are in The Guardian or the New York Times. So I don't think he's if everything else were ready to go to a better relationship or to a summit, I don't think he alone would be the reason not to do that.
Maybe unless somebody has a burning desire to answer that, maybe we just get some more questions. I'm really eager to hear what people have on their minds. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Eli Harrington, and I work at World Boston, and I was actually in the Beijing Olympics and was there for a few months before working with some journalists. So my question is, the Olympics are always a great opportunity to sort of crack down on human rights in the name of security. I'm wondering on the other side, besides LGBT issues, what domestic Russian human rights or other sort of smaller political issues might come to the stage during this Olympics, and what prospect do they have for being successful, considering that they will be diminishing Mr. Putin's luster? And I guess I would send that to Alexandra and Simone, if you could jump in as well. Thank you.
Well, it's true that Putin has been very thoughtful about what he's going to do about potential human rights problems before the Olympic, mostly in terms of trying to diminish the ones that he thinks are manageable. And I would point to the release of a lot of political prisoners from Khodorkovsky, to the women from Pussy Riot, a lot of other political prisoners. He just let them go in order to avoid that as an irritant. In terms of the LGBT rights, I mean, I think that Putin doesn't really see it as a significant problem. It's again, irritating that they're bringing it up at the Olympics, and there will surely be some rainbows at the opening ceremony and things like that. But frankly, it's so popular a view in Russia that it really costs him very little to say those sorts of things. And people that I've talked to in the regions, they basically think it's a great thing that he's taking a stand on traditional values. In terms of other human rights issues, I really wouldn't expect them, fortunately or unfortunately, to get much play during the Olympics. Again, because the Olympics themselves have so much momentum in terms of the sporting events, the stories of the athletes, and all of these kind of color stories. I suspect that we've already seen most of what's going to come out. And as far as I can tell, and maybe Simeon has a different view, but I don't see them getting that much traction in terms of weighting down the overall attempt to make the Olympics make Russia look good.
Simon?
I agree. Over 70% of Russians support Putin's decision to sign this bill into law, banning so-called gay propaganda among juniors. So this is not going to be an issue, at least domestically. Now, of course, the issues that are more important to Russian public for a number of reasons are playing out. And one of them is damage to the environment. We know that a number of environmental activists in the area have been investigated and even convicted just because they highlighted the damage to the environment. And I think it's a big issue, and it's going to continue during the Olympics, even though you won't hear much, because the area which is designated for mass protests, which, by the way, communists already used, is outside the focus of international media. But this issue will not go away. People feel strong about environment, and whether it's during Olympics or beyond Olympics, they are going to continue to champion this cause, and I think it's very good. It's very relevant for Russia.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Holly, and I'm a junior at the college. I think we've all heard about the deficiencies in infrastructure and accommodations that people have noticed over the past week. But I'm just wondering, in the course of the most expensive Olympics in history, how is it that Russia spent so much money building, buses for tours and expensive facilities for athletics and overlooked some of the most basic infrastructure?
That's an excellent question. In fact, we were discussing that just before this began. And it plays into, I think, an unfortunate narrative about Russia and shoddy construction. But Kevin, why don't you tackle that?
I will, but only if you'll agree to use some of your 9 years of living in that country to tell us some of your stories.
Actually, we could go back to when I was a student in Leningrad to really get into the infrastructure at that point. But no, Kevin, you please.
Yeah. I used to tell people that I knew that Russia looks like I built it, so I'm not really a good construction person. I don't know how to tile a bathroom. I don't know how to build stairs. But if I had to do it, that's how a lot of Russia would look today. I think there's a lack of these skills that really are still a product of the communist days that's still with us to some degree. You can see the good progress they made when Russians have proper training, get the skills that they need, and then they go and build something. Then you can actually see something that's fantastic. If you've been to Russia and looked at their subway system and seen these museum subway stops, they're magnificent. They were built at the early parts of the Soviet Union when the people still had these skills. And then if you look at a current, a later day metro stop, and you see a huge difference. I mean, just little things like that are signs of, I think it's a societal kind of problem. So why has that happened? That you can drain a whole bottle of vodka at the kitchen table trying to talk about that, I think.
I don't want to belabor this, but Simon, I thought I saw you shaking your head. Did that mean that you agree or you disagree?
I think Kevin is a wonderful builder. I've been to his house. It's magnificent. I think the problem is just bad management. And bad management is essentially a result of lack of competition. When contracts are awarded on basis of loyalties and so on, those who win them, they have no incentive to deliver. So therefore, the quality suffers. But I'd put things into perspective, and there have been positive reviews of what has been done. An International Olympic Committee member by the last name Casper said that it would take any other European city 150 years to build what Russia built in Sochi for the Olympics in 6 years. So, you know, there are always two sides to the story.
Good point. Yes, sir. You've been patiently waiting.
Hi, thank you. My name is Max Liebeskin. I'm a freshman at the college and a member of the JFK Junior Forum. And since you've been talking a lot about the Olympics, I'll maybe shift this question a little bit closer to the Snowden side of the issue. And my question is more generally about Russian foreign policy. Obviously, a lot of what's been in the news recently have been the negotiations that the United States and Russia and Syria are involved in about the potential for a transitional government in Syria. And so my question is, what do all of you see as the driving force or the underlying motive of Russia's policy on the Syria issue and related issues in the Middle East?
Mm-hmm. Alexandra, can you tackle that?
I would ask Kevin actually to tackle that.
Okay.
So I have I'll point out something that I think most of us miss because we're not, it's not that we don't think about Russia or try to know Russia, but it's because we don't understand the Muslim and the Islamic situation. So think about Sunni and Shia, and then think about Russia's problems in the Caucasus. So all of Russia's Islamic fundamentalist problems are Sunni origin. Sunni is the problem in the Russian eye, not Shia. So then what would you expect Russia's attitude to be toward Shia-dominated Iran? It's okay. You're not hurting me. And that's what their attitude is. What should it be toward Saudi Arabia, which is the origin of the Sunni? Should be bad, and that's what it is. Syria is a place where the Sunni-Shia battle is playing out. So whose side is Russia on? Well, experts would say, well, the Assad, they're not really Shia, they're something, but they're aligned with the Shia, and they're against the Sunni. I mean, in some respects, it's as simple as that. Now, there are a lot of other complicating factors, and there's arms sales, and there's port facilities, and there's everything else. But to my mind, that is a significant factor that influences Russia's position on what's going on in Syria. And I'd ask Simone and
Simone?
I'd say the other issue to point out is that Russia, as a principle, is opposed to any unlawful change of regime. It has to be a certain procedure has to be followed. You cannot just hold a revolution and unseat the government because it sets a dangerous precedent for former Soviet Union, which Russia seeks to have the crucial influence on. Therefore, Russia is not married to the idea of keeping Assad in power, but it wants that whatever happens is done in a proper manner, whether it's elections or negotiations. Also, Assad's government is a major buyer of Russian equipment. And it's not only just arms, it's also cars. I mean, how many countries buy Russian cars? How many Russians drive cars, Russian-made cars in Russia? Syrians buy them. If you want to keep your economy diversified from oil and gas, which dominates the GDP, you'd want buyers like Assad to buy arms, airliners, and cars from you. And I'd also point out that Assad is an ally of Iran, and Russia's foreign policy specifically says Russia seeks to play the balancing role. If Syria switches sides, so to say, Iran is weakened, the balance of power in the region is undermined, and therefore Russia finds itself without a viable ally to deter influence of external stakeholders in the region.
Really excellent points all. Is there somebody up at that microphone? Yes, okay, please.
Hi, my name is Ray, and I work at GE here. And my question is more about Ukraine. When Yanukovych started to lose control and lost Russian aid, that was kind of obvious. But what kind of perplexed me was Russia's reaction today when they said, well, it's the Americans who are funding the protesters and they're giving them arms. And I expect that in the Middle East. I didn't expect that in Russia. Where is Russia still viewing America as the demagogue to be sort of overcome all the time, or is that, where did that come from?
Yes.
This gets into, this would be great to talk about. Briefly, obviously we're into the color revolutions. I covered actually the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Tbilisi, Georgia, and there is fear, we can talk about this more, that the Russians really do believe on a number of levels that the US is trying to foment color revolutions in the former Soviet space. But Kevin, I heard a big yes.
Yeah, it's not rocket surgery, right? It's they see that as a plan. There are hints of it in American policy, right? We want the Rose Revolution. We want the Orange Revolution. We want a pro-Western government in the Ukraine. So that's reflected in how we talk and how we act and who we support and how we spend our money abroad. So are we the reason that all these people are upset in the Ukraine? No, that's ridiculous. But we certainly support that perspective or that point of view of these groups, and so therefore Russian leaders either sincerely believe that we're actually doing this, they could be believing that, or they use it as an excuse to say, you know, that's why the people of the Ukraine should not go this direction because it's actually just an idea from the West. You know, they saw what happened in all these countries, and then one of the turning points was in Uzbekistan when you had another kind of pro-Western government heading that direction, and then there were some uprisings, and the Russian leaders said, you need to squash that. The only way to save your skin and not end up like the guys in Georgia or in the Baltics or somewhere else out of power is if you come in hard. So violence is how you squash this, and I think that's the way Putin looks at it today.
Mm-hmm. Sir, do you have a question up there? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Jacob. I'm a sophomore at the college, and maybe this is not as a specific of a question, but I'm curious. You sort of touched on how personal the Olympics are to Putin, and I'm curious what impact Obama's sort of snub of announcing that he wasn't going to attend the games and was, you know, send all of these athletes. I mean, and maybe I don't know if the LGBT factor of having openly LGBT athletes attend, but mainly the fact that President Obama decided not to attend the games in Sochi has on either Putin's perspective or on sort of how it plays out in the Russian media.
Mm-hmm. Is there any particular person? I can think of one sitting in the middle. Alexandra, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I don't think that the Russians certainly would not have appreciated the fact that Obama isn't coming. But if he had come, it would have been taken as a signal that the whole LGBT thing is just not that significant in the US either, right? That the Russians ultimately know what's important and they know what's not important. And Obama understood that this was not worth kind of offending Putin over. And it kind of ties into this, to what Kevin was saying, and also the approach that the Russians have had, which is that they don't necessarily respond to compromise in the way that we would expect. In other words, if someone compromises on some issues, oftentimes they see that as a weakness and then press for more. Whereas one would expect that if you have a compromise, then you get a compromise in return. And I think the history, especially of the past 2 years of US-Russia relations, when the reset has really faltered, have shown that, in fact, the compromise approach did not really work well with the Russians. That to some extent, they really respect strength and strength of convictions. And even though they might disagree with Obama that LGBT rights are important, on some level they would respect him more for not coming than for coming and saying that he's coming even though he's upset about the LGBT issue.
Yes. Are you standing at the mic? Did you have a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I did.
Yes, please.
I just thought you asked me first.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I'm Ksenia. I actually come from Russia. I'm a HBS admit, and I only actually flew in last night, and I just wanted maybe to take the discussion to a bit like a high level. So taking into consideration all the political and economic problems just discussed, how sustainable do you actually see the whole Putin's regime? And I'm probably wondering not only about your personal opinion, but also about in general, whatever opinion you would have in the United States about how sustainable the whole system, the whole thing is. Thank you.
I think that this is a great Simone question because, Simone, you have a lot of different sources of information that you analyze what's going on in Russia. So the sustainability of the Putin, well, you could use the word regime, but let's call it the Putin presidency, the leadership of Putin.
I'd say it's fairly sustainable. It has showed how resilient it is. In the past 2 years, if you look what was happening 2 years ago, mass protests, Russia losing Syria, you could list a number of problems. Today, Assad is not going anywhere. Protests have subsided, and Putin feels so confident that he can release Khodorkovsky and allow Navalny to run for Moscow's mayor's office. But that said, there are, of course, longer-term trends that are not favorable. And that includes economic stagnation. Russia's economy has grown by a paltry 1.2%, I think, last year. Shrinking of the working force, even though the depopulation has stopped, but working force is projected to shrink by at least 10 million in the next several years. General backwardness of the Russian economy, the decreasing quality of the human capital, insurgency in the North Caucasus, lack of diversification, dependence on exports of commodities that Russia cannot influence, prices on which Russia cannot influence. These are all longer-term trends. Dominance of state in the economy. These are all longer-term trends that will continue to sap Putin's ability to rule if he wants to stay for the fourth term and then maybe let someone else come in and then come back again. I don't know. But what I see is that the longer-term trends are negative, and it will take someone with strong political will, not just capabilities, to try to reverse. And I don't think too many rulers that late in their rule try to make drastic decisions. So therefore, I see future is pretty bleak for Putin's presidency in the longer term, but not currently. Now, he's the king of the mountain. He's hosting the Olympics. Protests have subsided, and so on and so on. You can list his foreign policy achievements that even the American side has to acknowledge. Now everything looks more or less rosy.
Alexandra, this is your area of expertise, so what's your view?
Well, I think if we look back and think about what holds the system together, right? It's not really kind of the formal institutions of elections or courts or constitutions or anything like that. It's really a system of patron-client relations with Putin at the top of a big pyramid of patrons and sub-patrons, and very few competing networks that could perhaps take over. He's taking care of the oligarchs, he's taking care of the regional political machines that came under Yeltsin, and now the system kind of holds together because the expectations of the elite and the people within this pyramid that Putin is still going to be the one on top. So if you accept this kind of argument, then you think the things that could destabilize this would be anything that would change the expectations of the people who continue to support him, because it's very expensive to support someone else and make a mistake. There's what we call the collective action problem, that the elites won't jump unless they're pretty confident. So if you look at what's happened in the Eurasia, in these former Soviet states, you have these situations where you have these pyramids of patron-client relations, and the most dangerous moments for the leaders come either in the succession period, because they're coming to end of their term limits, or maybe they're a lame duck, which would suggest that for Putin, if he runs in 2018, at that point, you start expecting a lot of instability because everyone is going to be looking out to see who's coming after those 6 years are finished. The other thing that can happen is some miscalculation or something that changes the underlying popular support that Putin obviously has. So this could be the economic slowdown that gets worse and that generally starts affecting people, affecting the ability to index pensions, for example. You could have a miscalculation in terms of a policy, like the attempt to monetize some of the social benefits, which created huge protests. And if that would happen, and all of a sudden people looked around and realized that Putin actually wasn't as great a leader as they think he is, and he does seem to be genuinely able to win elections and be popular, then you would have expectations change and you could expect to have a crisis. But I wouldn't believe that any of the demonstrations along the lines of what we've seen in the past would be enough to force that to happen.
I think we have a few more minutes for questions. Good. Could we, sir?
Okay, thank you. My name is David Samuelson. I study public administration here at the Kennedy School. My question is about the military rearmament of Russia that has happened over the last years, combined with Putin's more aggressive foreign policy. And how do you regard that from the view of outside of Russia? I live in Sweden, a small country close to Russia that has lived in the shadow of Russia for centuries. And there, of course, there is always a big discussion on what you see of different signs of how assertive and strong Russia is in the foreign policy.
Kevin.
So a couple of facts. First of all, Sweden at one time beat Russia up in that realm, right? So you guys. So the second thing is that I think the military budget for Russia and their military wants to be about 1.2 million people in uniform, and ours is maybe about that too. And so our budget is somewhere around $700 billion, according to SIPRI out of Stockholm. And I think the Russian budget in that same book was listed at $72 billion, so about 10 times less than the United States budget. So in terms of a threat to countries that are not immediately on Russia's border, in other words, close by, I would say the Russian military is not an external threat, especially to Sweden, which is a whole country over, or to the United States. The only exception being the nuclear weapons, right? So if you discount that, if you say we're not going to have a nuclear war, then so as a threat, so the spending to me is not a sign of a threat that Russia is to me. The spending is an attempt by Russia to try and professionalize its military, to get it back up off its knees, basically. And they have had some slow progress in this regard. But it may sound a little odd coming from me, they need to spend this money on their military. They need a more professional military, because a country that does not feel secure with because of its military acts as an insecure individual would, and that's not good when you're trying to deal with them. They need a stronger conventional military. So I applaud their increased military budget, as long as they spend it properly and it doesn't go into corruption and so on and so forth.
Kevin, I want you to tweet that in Washington.
Okay.
I want you to write in on buildings and see what happens. Thank you. Sir, did you have a question?
Hi, my name is John, and I'm from the Kennedy School. Oftentimes in American politics, the urgent trumps the important. And right now in Sochi, there's nothing more urgent than the Olympics. But I wonder what's going to happen after the party's over. What do you think that Putin or Greater Russia will be focusing on after the Olympics?
That is a question that a lot of people are asking. Simon, why don't you kick us off? Because this really, there is that theory that, under the spotlight, as Alexandra said, he's released Khodorkovsky and others, everything is looking rosy, and the cameras will leave, and in the darkness, bad things will happen. Do you agree with that?
I don't think there'll be darkness. Russia is going to host the World Soccer Cup in 2018. So cameras will be back, and not just to Sochi, but all over European part of Russia. Well, I've sort of touched upon this earlier. In the immediate aftermath, we'll be looking at an effort to capitalize on the infrastructure that Russia has built, to link it to other parts of the area, to build this tourism cluster that would hopefully attract up to 4 million tourists a year and create 160,000 jobs, which Russia, again, needs to diversify its economy. But there are, of course, bigger issues. And domestically, the biggest issue is economy. Russia's economy has been stagnating. Russia's central bank chairman has spoken of stagflation. Russia is in need of systemic fundamental reforms that reverse some of the adverse trends we've seen in Russia, including increase of the state's share in GDP. I'd say Putin has been trying already to reverse the situation, and I expect him to do more in that sphere. In terms of security, I'd like to underscore that, you know, insurgency doesn't end with the end of Sochi Games. There's what Russians call partizanskaya vayna, guerrilla war going on in the North Caucasus. The number of security officers killed in the North Caucasus in Russia, in the North Caucasus last year was 160. That's only 30 more than the number of personnel killed in Afghanistan of the NATO-led mission there. So it's a huge problem, and Russia would have to deal with that. It won't go away. And in terms of foreign policy, you know, there are immediate challenges, continuing to try to facilitate a peaceful resolution of the Syrian civil war, Iran's nuclear program, but also to try to mend fences with the United States, because you cannot be on bad terms with a superpower indefinitely. And hopefully the bilateral meeting that the two sides are now discussing to hold in June, again in Sochi, would help to address that.
Thank you. Sir, please.
I'm Alex Ayafreda. I'm a junior at the college studying economics and pursuing a secondary in Russian studies. A few days ago, Ambassador McFaul announced that he would be stepping down after the Olympics. What are the implications for U.S.-Russian relations, and can we speculate as to a successor? Thank you.
This sounds like a question for Kevin, and I just would add I've been following a lot of that because I know the ambassador and the Twitter world, social media, have been really burning up. You probably saw that. But both Russians and Americans talking about the significance of Ambassador McFaul leaving. He's an academic by trade from Stanford, and he was very well known, as we all know, for his work in describing and writing about color revolutions. And that was one of the issues that complicated his arrival in Moscow as ambassador. But Kevin, what would you say?
So I think in terms of his stepping down affecting U.S.-Russian relations, again, not going to be a big factor. I mean, the ambassador can be an important person in facilitating those relations. But, you know, Ambassador McFaul had a very rocky time. If you're a proponent of the things that he championed, like human rights and let's say democracy building and so on, then you think he did a good job and he broke a few dishes in the China shop and that was the way it was supposed to be. But if you were maybe a career diplomat or somebody who just wanted, you know, the U.S. and Russia to get along so that we could do other things, maybe that you thought were more important, then you thought McFaul was not necessarily helpful to that cause. But at the end of the day, I think he did a commendable job in his time there, and I have no idea who the replacement is going to be. You know, typically for these things, you either want a career diplomat who understands Russia and then therefore does a great job leading a diplomatic mission, or you need somebody who's very close to the president. In other words, somebody who can be a direct line from Putin, Lavrov, and so on, back to the president. McFaul was in that second category. Maybe Obama will go with the first category this time. Who knows? I don't know. Do you have an opinion?
Well,
have you heard a rumor?
I'm not a Washington insider, but I've read in Western press, actually in Foreign Policy's cable news portal, that Rose Goldmuller the acting Under-Secretary of State, is one candidate. I agree with Kevin, it would be better if the next ambassador is a career diplomat, but there are conflicting reports. Foreign policy says it might be Rose Müller, but actually if you look at Russian segment of Twitter, the picture that is tweeting is that of Steven Seagal. I mean, he's on very good relations with the Russian leadership, and you know, he can be the next ambassador according to the Russian Twitter.
Well, that's why you can't trust social media, Simone. Alexandra, as long as we're taking bets here, we could make some money. What do you think?
I would agree, actually, with both Simeon and Kevin, that it's very likely to be a career diplomat, if only because for bureaucratic reasons, you need every once in a while people to come in and sort of follow the standard operating procedures in an organization. And I think one of the things that made McFaul both kind of entrepreneurial in terms of Russia also made it difficult for him to work with the established State Department bureaucracy, and that there needs to be a sort of internal reset in order for them to work as effectively as they can in Russia.
I'll just put a plug in for Rose Gottmuller because I'm a huge fan of hers. She's the person who really negotiated the new START treaty. She is a super brain when it comes to, and Kevin, this is your bailiwick, so I don't know whether you agree.
I agree 100%.
She's really quite impressive on anything that deals with nuclear issues, disarmament, etc. So she knows her stuff.
I think maybe one of the best compliments she ever got was and I don't know the exact name of the Russian counterpart, but as she was coming back, she had run the Carnegie office in Moscow too, but as she was coming back from the State Department, one of the Russian diplomats was talking about who's leading the U.S. delegation, and somebody said Rose Gottmuller, and he turned to his colleagues and said, we're in trouble.
And actually, I think one great thing about Rose Gottmuller, and people behind the scenes, but especially Rose, they have very good relations with good people in Russia who want to do things that protect people around the world. I mean, when you look at arms control and the new START agreement, there are people in Russia who wanted those agreements just as much as some Americans did, and she was able to work very successfully and cooperatively with people like that. Do we have any more quick questions here? If not, I guess we're finished. I just want to say a big thanks to everybody on our panel, Simone, Alexandra, Kevin, and also to urge you to watch the opening of the Olympics, because I do think, I've seen some pictures, at least one picture, from somebody who was in there at the rehearsal, and it's going to be a mind-boggling extravaganza with reportedly 800 dancers and incredible images. So I would urge you to tune in. It will be pretty impressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good job.